Before marriage, how did humans choose a partner? Imagine Earth tens of thousands of years ago. There were no cities, no governments, no marriage certificates, no wedding halls, and no legal documents defining who was a husband or wife. Small groups of humans moved through forests, grasslands, and open landscapes. They hunted animals, gathered plants, searched for water, protected themselves from predators, and depended heavily on one another for survival. But there is one important misconception we should avoid. The absence of formal marriage does not mean that early humans changed sexual partners every day. There is no evidence that all early humans lived that way. In many human societies, long-lasting relationships between men and women were possible and may have been important for raising children. But relationships were not necessarily identical everywhere. Different human groups could have followed very different customs. So imagine one small human group. A man and a woman begin spending much of their time together. They sleep near the same fire. They search for food together. They protect each other. Eventually, the woman becomes pregnant and gives birth. Now something very important happens. A human baby is extremely dependent. Unlike many animals, a human child needs years of care before becoming independent. The mother needs food. The baby needs protection. Someone needs to collect food. Someone needs to watch for danger. Someone may need to carry the child while others are hunting or gathering. This creates an enormous advantage for cooperation. A long-term partner could potentially provide food, protection, and assistance. But this does not mean every ancient human family looked like the modern nuclear family. Some societies may have depended heavily on mothers and their relatives. Others could have involved fathers, grandparents, siblings, and wider members of the group. Human childcare could therefore be a group effort. And this leads to one of the biggest questions in the story of marriage. If a woman has a child, everyone can identify the mother. But what about the father? Biological fatherhood was not always equally obvious in every relationship system. If a particular man stayed closely with the woman throughout her pregnancy, he might consider himself the child's father. But in a society where relationships were less exclusive, determining biological fatherhood could be more complicated. Yet perhaps the bigger question was not simply, who is the father? It was, who will help raise this child? Who will provide food? Who will protect the mother? Who will protect the child? Who will stay? These questions could make long-term partnerships socially valuable. Marriage did not suddenly appear as an invention. Instead, humans gradually developed increasingly complex ways of organizing relationships, children, relatives, and responsibilities. And that takes us to the next problem. Because having a child was only the beginning. Someone had to take responsibility for raising that child. And that question would eventually force human societies to create clearer rules around relationships. Before there was marriage, there were already relationships. Before there were husbands and wives, there were partners. And before there were formal families, there were children who needed to be cared for.
A baby has been born. The mother is known. But now the real challenge begins. The child needs constant care. Food must be found. Shelter must be maintained. Dangerous animals must be avoided. The baby must be carried. And eventually, the child must be taught how to survive. For early humans, raising a child was not easy. There were no supermarkets, no hospitals, no modern houses, no emergency services. Food could disappear. Weather could become dangerous. Injury could mean death. So raising a child required cooperation. The mother might receive help from her own mother, sisters, brothers, or other members of the group. This is one reason anthropologists often discuss humans as highly cooperative child rearers. But there is another important person who could become involved: the mother's long-term partner. If a man remained with a woman, he could help find food, protect the group, carry resources, and protect the child. This could create a strong social relationship between the man, woman, and child. But again, we should not imagine that every ancient society had exactly the same arrangement. Human societies have always been diverse. In some groups, maternal relatives could be extremely important. In others, fathers could play major roles. In others, children could receive care from many members of the community. So the development of marriage cannot simply be explained as women needed men to provide food. That would be far too simplistic. The real story is more complicated. Humans needed cooperation, and long-term relationships could sometimes make cooperation easier. But another problem could appear. What happened when relationships became complicated? Suppose a woman had relationships with more than one man. Suppose a man had relationships with more than one woman. Who was responsible for the child? Who was considered the child's father? Who had obligations toward the mother? Who could form a long-term partnership with whom? And perhaps most importantly, what relationships were socially acceptable? These questions would not necessarily have one universal answer. Different communities developed different rules. Some societies developed relatively stable pair relationships. Some accepted forms of polygyny. Some had other relationship arrangements. Some placed great importance on maternal relatives. Others emphasized paternal descent. The important point is this. Early human societies were not necessarily without rules. They could have had very strong rules about relationships, even without modern marriage. There could be rules about who could have sexual relationships with whom. There could be restrictions involving close relatives. There could be expectations about who should help raise children. There could be rules about exchanging gifts or forming alliances between families. And these rules could gradually transform a private relationship into something recognized by the wider community. A relationship was no longer simply, these two people are together. It could become, this relationship has a recognized place within our society. That was an important step, but it still wasn't necessarily the marriage system we recognize today. To understand the next stage, we have to look at something even bigger than individual relationships. We have to look at the group itself.
Imagine living in a small community where almost everyone knows everyone else. You know who your mother is. You know your siblings. You know your grandparents and other relatives. You know which people belong to your group. Now imagine that relationships have no social boundaries at all. A person could form a sexual relationship with anyone. There would be no rules about close relatives. There would be no expectations about long-term partners. There would be no social recognition of children. Such a system would create enormous complexity. But here is the important point. We should not assume that early humans actually lived without rules. Humans are deeply social animals. And human communities tend to create rules about relationships. One of the most widespread examples is the prohibition of sexual relationships between close relatives, often called incest taboo. Exactly how these rules first developed is unknown. There was no single moment when humanity collectively decided to create them. Different societies developed different systems over extremely long periods of time. Some communities organized people into clans or kin groups. Some traced descent through the mother's side. Others emphasized the father's side. Some required people to find partners outside their immediate kin group. These systems could have had important social consequences. Imagine a man forming a relationship with a woman from another group. That relationship could potentially create a connection between two communities. The relationship might involve exchanges of food, gifts, protection, labor, or social cooperation. So relationships were not always just about two individuals. They could connect families, relatives, and entire communities. This is where the idea of social recognition becomes important. A relationship could be recognized by the group. People could know, this man and this woman are partners. Their child could be recognized as belonging to a particular family or kin group. The man's relatives could have certain responsibilities. The woman's relatives could have certain responsibilities. And the relationship could become part of the social structure. This is one of the foundations from which later marriage systems could develop. But we need to be careful. There was probably no single universal sequence like, first there was no marriage, then everyone agreed on marriage, and suddenly marriage appeared. Human history was much messier. Different societies experimented with different ways of organizing relationships. Some relationships may have been relatively permanent. Others may have been less permanent. Some societies recognized multiple spouses. Others emphasized one long-term pair. Some societies placed children primarily within the mother's kin group. Others emphasized the father's lineage. The word, marriage, therefore represents many different historical institutions. And yet, across many societies, marriage eventually became a way of publicly organizing important relationships. Who is considered a spouse? Who is responsible for whom? How are children connected to their parents and relatives? What obligations exist between families? These questions became increasingly important. Then something happened that changed human society dramatically. Humans began settling down. They started farming. They began controlling land and producing food. And suddenly, relationships became connected to something new: property. For most of human history, people lived as hunter-gatherers. They moved across landscapes. They hunted animals. They collected plants. They searched for water. Their possessions had to be portable. But thousands of years ago, in different parts of the world, some human societies began farming and living in more permanent settlements. This was a revolutionary change. People could now cultivate crops. They could keep animals. They could build more permanent houses. They could store food. And gradually, certain forms of property became much more important. A field was no longer simply a place where someone happened to find food. It could be cultivated year after year. A herd could grow. A house could remain within a family. Stored food could support people through difficult seasons. And this created a new question. Who gets these resources after someone dies? This is where inheritance becomes important. But we should make one thing very clear. Inheritance was probably not the original reason marriage appeared. Long-term relationships and marriage-like systems existed in human societies before large-scale farming and complex property systems. However, once settled agriculture developed, property and inheritance could make family relationships much more important. Imagine a farmer who has spent decades cultivating land. He has children. When he dies, who should receive the land? His children? His siblings? His wife's relatives? The wider community? Different societies answered these questions differently. But the questions themselves became increasingly important. Now the identity and social position of children could matter more. A society might need to establish who belongs to which family or lineage. And marriage could become one of the institutions used to define relationships between adults, children, families, and property. Again, this does not mean humans invented marriage because they wanted to protect property. That would be an oversimplification. Marriage had many possible functions. It could organize sexual relationships. It could connect families. It could establish responsibilities toward children. It could create alliances between groups. It could regulate residence and kinship. And in some societies, it could help organize property and inheritance. As societies became more complex, marriage could therefore become more formal. There might be ceremonies. There might be exchanges of gifts or wealth. Families could become involved. Religious traditions could become involved. Community approval could become important. Eventually, in some societies, marriage became connected to formal laws. But this development did not happen everywhere at the same time. There was no single path. There was no single inventor. There was no universal wedding ceremony that humanity adopted. Instead, different cultures created different systems. And this brings us to the final question. If marriage developed gradually, what exactly turned a relationship into a marriage? The answer lies in one powerful idea: social recognition. So, where did marriage actually come from? Was there a first man who invented it? Was there a first woman who suggested it? Was there a specific day when humanity suddenly decided to get married? No, we do not know of any single historical moment when marriage was invented. There is no known name of the first married couple, and there is no evidence that marriage emerged from one single cause. Instead, marriage appears to have developed in different forms across different human societies. The story begins much earlier. Humans formed relationships. Some relationships became long-term. Children were born. Children needed care. Adults needed cooperation. Communities developed rules about sexual relationships and kinship. People needed ways to organize relationships between individuals and groups. Then, in many societies, relationships became increasingly recognized by the community. That recognition is crucial. A relationship was no longer simply private. The wider society could say, these two people are recognized as partners. That recognition could create expectations. The partners might owe responsibilities to one another. Their children could be recognized within a particular family or kin group. Their relatives could become connected. In some societies, property and inheritance could become connected to the relationship. In others, marriage could create alliances between families or communities. Religious rituals could later give marriage another layer of meaning. Governments could eventually create legal definitions. And modern societies added concepts such as legal rights, contracts, divorce, and civil marriage. But none of these appeared overnight. Marriage was transformed repeatedly as human society transformed. That is why marriage looks so different around the world. Some societies historically practiced monogamy. Some practiced forms of polygyny. Some recognized other forms of marital relationships. Some emphasized the mother's lineage. Others emphasized the father's. Some marriages involved elaborate ceremonies. Others could be established through simpler community recognition. So if we ask, why did humans get married? The most accurate answer is not one sentence. Marriage likely became important because humans needed ways to organize relationships, children, kinship, responsibilities, cooperation, and, later in many societies, property and inheritance. But the exact path was different from culture to culture. The first relationships may have existed long before formal marriage. The first marriage ceremony may be impossible to identify. And the first person to call someone a husband or wife is lost to prehistory. What we can see is the gradual transformation. Relationship, then child, then responsibility, then social rules, then, in increasingly complex societies, family, property, and inheritance. And eventually, in many different forms, marriage. So marriage was not simply an invention. It was part of humanity's much larger attempt to organize one of the most complicated things humans have ever created. Relationships between people.